It was a cold January morning, and the flight from New York to Los Angeles was almost ready to take off. Among the passengers, there was a young black girl, no older than 16, sitting in a corner seat with her elderly grandmother. They were quiet, barely drawing attention to themselves, but there was something about the way they looked that made people glance twice. The flight attendants moved briskly through the cabin, preparing for takeoff. Among them was a woman named Sarah, an American with striking blonde hair and a firm, no-nonsense attitude. But there was something more beneath her professional exterior, something not everyone could see. No one could have predicted what would happen next. As Sarah passed the girl and her grandmother, she slowed down, looking at their clothes with a certain disdain. They were dressed simply, nothing extravagant. The grandmother in a modest dress, and the girl in an old hoodie and jeans. But that wasn't what caught Sarah's eye. It was their presence. They didn't belong in the first-class cabin. As the flight attendant passed by, she muttered under her breath, loud enough for the girl to hear, "You're poor. And your clothes? They don't even meet our airline standards." The girl, stunned by the words, said nothing. Her grandmother, too, remained quiet, a soft sigh escaping her lips. Sarah didn't stop there. "These seats are reserved for richer families. You should know your place." Her words were harsh, filled with a bitterness that seemed to come from deep within. The flight attendant's judgment was clear. She had no idea that this simple encounter was about to change everything. As the plane ascended, the mood in the cabin grew heavy. The girl, still shocked by the confrontation, leaned back into her seat, trying to block out the cruel words. Her grandmother, who had been through a lifetime of adversity, simply closed her eyes, her face unreadable. Sarah's harsh comments had not gone unnoticed. A few passengers who had overheard the exchange exchanged uneasy glances. Some shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with what they had just heard, but said nothing. They were, after all, just passengers. It was none of their business. But deep down, they felt it, the weight of prejudice. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Sarah didn't care. She was too busy maintaining her perfect facade. She moved through the cabin, serving drinks and snacks, her attitude colder than ever. However, her gaze kept returning to the girl and her grandmother. What bothered Sarah the most was that despite her outward disdain, there was something about the girl's calm demeanor that irked her. The girl wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She didn't fight back. This only made Sarah more furious. "Who does she think she is?" Sarah muttered to herself as she walked past again, staring at the girl's modest clothes with disdain. But little did Sarah know, she had just made a mistake she couldn't undo. As the flight continued, a strange silence settled over the cabin. The passengers were starting to feel the tension from earlier, unsure whether they should intervene or ignore the situation. The girl, still clutching her grandmother's hand, stared out the window, her mind racing. It was at that moment she decided to do something unexpected. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. "Call Dad," she whispered softly, almost to herself. The device buzzed with a response. A few moments later, her father's deep voice filled her ear. "Hey, baby girl, what's up?" The girl hesitated for a moment before speaking, careful to keep her tone steady. "Dad, I need you to do something for me," she began, her eyes flicking nervously towards Sarah, who was busy serving drinks in the aisle. "It's important." Meanwhile, Sarah had no idea what was happening. She thought the girl was just another passenger, someone easy to overlook, someone who didn't matter. But what happened next would make her realize how wrong she was. As the plane cruised high above the clouds, an announcement came over the intercom. The voice was calm, official, but the words, they were anything but ordinary. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an important update for you. Effective immediately, the owner of this airline has changed hands." The passengers froze, confused murmurs rippling through the cabin. What was going on? Sarah, who had just poured a drink for another passenger, didn't hear the announcement at first. But when she looked up, the expression on everyone's faces said it all. Something had shifted. The captain's voice continued. "We are proud to announce that the new owner of this airline is none other than..." The young lady seated in row 5B alongside her grandmother. "Please join me in welcoming our new owner." A stunned silence fell over the cabin. Sarah's mouth went dry. She looked down at the girl, now sitting straight in her seat, her eyes calm but filled with a certain quiet confidence. The same girl Sarah had judged so harshly, the one she'd called poor, the one she'd humiliated. It was her, the new owner. As Sarah's mind raced, trying to process the information, she felt her knees weaken. The weight of her previous actions, the insults she'd hurled, suddenly seemed like they were coming back to haunt her. The girl, with her phone still pressed to her ear, looked over at Sarah, who was now standing frozen in the aisle. She said nothing at first, but her eyes, they were filled with something Sarah hadn't expected. Pity. The girl's father was the owner of this entire airline, the same girl Sarah had considered beneath her. The passengers, now fully aware of the situation, whispered among themselves. Sarah could hear the murmurs, the shock in their voices. She felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. The woman who had once held all the power in the cabin was now reduced to a simple flight attendant. No one had expected the truth to come out like this. But what would Sarah do now? It wasn't long before Sarah could no longer avoid the truth. The moment she realized what had just happened, her heart sank. The girl's father had purchased the entire airline. It was his company now. Her own actions, her own cruel behavior, had just cost her everything. As Sarah tried to maintain her composure, the plane began to descend toward Los Angeles. The tension in the air was palpable. Passengers exchanged looks, waiting for what would happen next. Sarah knew she couldn't run from this. She had to face the consequences. But how could she apologize? How could she make amends for the vile things she had said? The plane touched down in Los Angeles. As the passengers began to disembark, Sarah stood frozen in place. Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew she had to approach the girl, but how? The girl and her grandmother, calm and collected, were among the last to leave the plane. The girl caught Sarah's eye as she passed, and for the briefest moment, there was a flicker of something. Empathy? Understanding? It was hard to tell. Sarah took a deep breath and walked over to the girl. I'm so sorry, Sarah began, her voice shaking. I was wrong. I shouldn't have judged you like that. I didn't know. The girl met her eyes and nodded slowly. I understand, she said quietly. But it's not about understanding. It's about changing. It's about not judging someone by what they wear or how they look. Sarah felt her stomach churn with shame. I'm sorry. I should have never thought that way, Sarah murmured. The girl smiled faintly, offering a piece of advice that would stay with Sarah forever. Next time, just remember, don't judge anyone by their clothes or their skin. And with that, the girl and her grandmother walked off the plane, leaving Sarah to confront the mess she had created. Back at the airline's headquarters, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of regret. It was like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. The girl, the new owner of the airline, had forgiven her. But Sarah knew she couldn't forgive herself so easily. She thought back to how she'd spoken to the girl, how she'd assumed things based solely on appearances. She'd been wrong. So very wrong. Her phone buzzed with an email from HR. The subject read, "Immediate review of conduct." The weight of the consequences was real. Would she still have a job by the end of the day? The investigation didn't take long. The airline had a strict policy against discrimination, and Sarah's actions had crossed a line. She was called into the office, where her manager sat waiting. "Sarah, we've received complaints," he said coldly, "and it seems you've violated company policies in more ways than one." Sarah tried to explain, but there was no defense for what she had done. The evidence was clear. She had targeted the girl, the new owner. Her fate was sealed. Weeks passed since Sarah's suspension, and each day felt like a reminder of her mistake. The weight of her actions, the words she had spoken to the girl and her grandmother, haunted her. Sarah knew she couldn't undo the hurt, but she had to try and make amends. One evening, she came across a post about the new airline owner. The girl was now making headlines, leading the airline with her grandmother by her side. Sarah realized how wrong she had been. The girl wasn't just wealthy, she was a trailblazer. Sarah's assumptions had been shallow and unfounded. Determined to make things right, Sarah sat down and wrote an apology letter to the girl. She admitted her mistake, expressed her regret, and promised to learn from her actions. It was the hardest thing she had done, but it felt necessary. A few days later, she received a reply. The girl thanked Sarah for her apology, saying it was clear Sarah had reflected and was on a path of change. The girl forgave her, not out of obligation, but because of Sarah's sincerity. The road to redemption wasn't easy, but Sarah was ready. She knew that true growth came from recognizing her mistakes and working to become a better person.